There's a couple of things you got to look for there's probably 3 factors with watercolor paper. The first one is the weight. So 300 GSM is the heaviest one that I use. This is the Arches. It's acid-free, excellent. And then 300 GSM weighs 140 pounds per square inch. So that's the weight of the paper. And so if you take a square meter or a square inch and you weigh it, that's the weight. So the weight of the paper tells you how thick the paper is. The thickness of the paper helps with if you load more colour into it, or water, watercolour, so it's water really, being loaded onto the paper, it's got enough to soak into. And so you can get away with putting more big deep puddles of colour on there and the paper doesn't buckle. It stays flat-ish. So heavier weight is great because you can really load on the juice and the paper doesn't go, oh no, I'm going to buckle and ripple. That's one reason why I like the heavier weight. If you use the thinner weight paper, you get more buckling as it dries. And also it doesn't soak in as much water, so sometimes you can have a puddle sitting on top of the paper and then it can go sideways and cause a runback or a cauliflower, which is uncool. So there's 3 types of textures. This is in the good quality pads where they're actually labeling them as this one, or this one. So in some of the cheaper ones, they don't even say because they've got their own little mould that they put the paper in and squish it into, and that's their own pattern. And sometimes it doesn't really match what some of the big name brands like Arches and Fabriano and those sort of brands. But in those top watercolour brands, the first one is rough. So rough is really tall mountains and deep valleys across the surface of the paper. Really, really, like you can feel it. It's like big bumps and big valleys. So rough is what I use for really big paintings when I want a lot of texture and excitement to happen in the surface of the paper. So I want really big versions of that sort of stuff going on. And I only use the rough for really huge paintings because if you get a little piece of rough paper, it's got, like it might only have 20 bumps across it. And you try and do a little detailed church or something in there and the spire will be going, whoop, because it'll go up a hill, down a valley, and then like you'll try and draw it even and you won't be able to draw it neatly because your pencil's going boom, boom, boom across the mountains and the valleys. So I never use rough for small artworks, only for big and only when I want really exciting textures to happen. The one that I use the most is medium. It's also known as cold pressed. So when they make this cotton rag paper, they put mushy, wet cotton pulp and they pour it into a mould, a big flat mould, and then they press it. And so cold press, there's no heat involved, it's just a gentle press. And so that is what this pad is. It's my favourite texture to paint on is the medium cold pressed. So this one says cold pressed on here. That's a medium texture. It's my favourite to paint on. Like 90% of my artworks, I'm doing it on cold pressed medium. It's what I always recommend beginners use. It's really forgiving. You can paint little paintings on it, no problem. You get a nice, it evens out the water nicely because the water can sort of fall into the valleys, and so instead of having a big puffy puddle, it sort of goes whoop, across all of the mountains and sits in the valleys, and it spreads itself out really nicely, so that prevents watermarks. Really forgiving for beginners to use because you can also draw it up. It's nice for small paintings as well as big paintings. So these are the 3 factors. So you can get thin, medium press, medium cold press. You could get 300 GSM. You can even shell out for 600 GSM, but I only ever do that if it's really serious and I'm feeling very cocky and confident and I want to do something big and it needs to be really like card. It costs a lot, so it's ridiculous. So I very rarely, I did it once. I bought a 600 GSM once, but then I felt all nervous because I knew how much it would cost, and then I went, oh my God, what if it doesn't work? I've wasted my... I think it's better to just be relaxed about the materials. If you're putting too much money or effort into preparing a sheet, then you start to get scared that if things go wrong, you'll be too sad. So the third texture is called smooth or hot pressed. So hot pressed is they still press it into the mold, but it's a smoother mold, but they also use heat to really squish it flat. Smooth or hot pressed is really tricky for beginners. If any of those pads are very smooth in the texture, you'll probably get lots of runbacks and cauliflowers, because smooth paper, it still absorbs the liquid, but because it doesn't spread it nicely between valleys of any texture, it's just smooth paper, really smooth paper, then if you have a puffy puddle and a flat bit, bang, you're going to get a run back where the puffy puddle runs back into the flat bit. Whereas if you've got mountains and valleys, they kind of just run into little rivers between the valleys and it doesn't look so bad at all. I only ever use smooth when I'm doing teeny tiny little fine detail things, or if I'm just doing a little birthday card for someone, then you're not going to put too much water on. It's only a little tiny painting anyway, so you're not going to load like tons of colour on like you have to do for something like that. Upside down, Miss Jane. There you go. So if you're doing inking over a watercolour and it's small, hot press is really good, the smooth, because your pen doesn't bump around. It just runs smoothly over the paper. So if you're using one of those pigment pens like this has got that little tiny nib on the end of it there. It's like a sort of tiny felt tip. And if you're using this on the rough or the medium cold pressed paper too much, you'll actually, I've done it, I've worn down the tip. On smooth hot pressed paper, it's much more forgiving on your pens because it's not going bang, mountain, down the river, bang, mountain, as it's going across the paper. That's the three papers, and smooth or hot press is the most unforgiving for beginners. You have to really know how to load the colour on and keep the whole paper evenly wet. Don't let some areas get wetter than other areas, because you know that's going to dry first and that's going to stay wet. And really smooth can sometimes act a little bit like wood polish. Because it's got no texture, it can't help the water to soak in evenly across the sheet.